You have been reading people wrong for so long, not because you're unintelligent, not because you're careless, because no one ever taught you where to actually look. You were taught to listen to words, to trust what people say, to take sentences at face value, to believe that if someone tells you I'm fine, they are in fact fine. But words are the least honest currency human beings trade in. The real information about who someone is, what they fear, what they're hiding, what they've never said out loud even to themselves, lives underneath the sentence, in the pause before it, in the flinch after it, in the joke that comes half a second too late to be spontaneous. Friedrich Nietzsche spent his life obsessed with exactly this gap, the space between who we perform ourselves to be and who we actually are. Underneath that performance, he wasn't interested in manners or small talk or surface psychology. He was interested in the architecture hiding beneath the mask, and what happens the moment that architecture cracks. This is not a quick list you can skim in 5 minutes and forget by tomorrow. This is 18 truths, broken into 3 parts, each one deliberately built on the one before it. If you skip a part, the truths that come after will feel interesting but hollow, like reading the last chapter of a book without the first 200 pages. Stay with all 3, and something will happen that most people never expect. You won't just learn to read a stranger across a room. You'll start recognizing your own patterns in real time, which is a far more uncomfortable and far more valuable gift. Let's begin. First is the mask. Every single person you have ever met has been performing for you, in one way or another. This isn't an insult, and it isn't even usually conscious. Nietzsche believed the self we present to the world is a survival costume, something stitched together piece by piece, every time the raw and unfiltered version of us got punished, mocked, or ignored. The tragedy isn't that people wear masks. The tragedy is that most people have worn theirs. For so long they've forgotten. It's a costume at all. They think the mask is the face. Truth 1. The mask exists because honesty was once punished. Somewhere in a classroom, a childhood home, a friendship, a marriage, every person learned a version of the same lesson. The truest version of me is too much, too loud, too needy, too emotional, too intense, or simply too inconvenient for the people around me. So instead of abandoning connection altogether, they built a version of themselves that could survive the room, a softer voice, a more agreeable opinion, a laugh that arrives on cue instead of when something is actually funny. This isn't dishonesty in the way we usually punish dishonesty. It's armor, built one social injury at a time. And like all armor, it has weak points. Watch for the moments the mask strains, a flicker of irritation that doesn't match the calm voice delivering it, a hand that grips a coffee cup a little too tightly during an easy conversation, an answer that arrives just a beat too fast, like it was prepared in advance rather than felt in the moment. That strain, that crack, that half second of friction, that's where the real person is standing, waiting to be noticed. Think about the co-worker who is unfailingly pleasant, who never complains, who always says, "It's totally fine," when a project gets dumped on their desk at the last minute. Most people read this as genuine ease. Nietzsche would have told you to watch. What happens the one time that person finally snaps over something small and seemingly unrelated, a stapler out of place? A meeting running 5 minutes long, that disproportionate reaction isn't about the stapler. It's the mask finally buckling under, the weight of everything it's been holding back. Truth 2. What disgusts someone is a map of what they're hiding. Watch closely at what a person cannot stop criticizing in other people. Nietzsche understood this mechanism, what we now casually call projection, long before it became therapy speak. The parts of ourselves that we cannot bear to look at directly get exiled outward, relocated onto someone else, where they become far easier to attack than to confront in the mirror. The man who cannot tolerate weakness in others, who mocks anyone who cries or asks for help, is very often at war with his own vulnerability. The woman who constantly accuses her friends of trying too hard, or being fake, is frequently terrified that she herself isn't trying hard enough, or that her own effort will be seen as desperate. This is why Nietzsche's advice, translated into modern terms, would be simple. Don't listen to what someone praises. Praise is decoration. Listen to what makes their voice tighten. When they condemn it, that tightness is the sound of a private wound being touched by accident. You'll notice this everywhere once you start looking. The relative who constantly comments on other people's weight is rarely at peace with their own body. The friend who mocks attention seekers online is often quietly starving for the same attention and ashamed of the hunger. Contempt is rarely about the target. It's a spotlight aimed outward to keep everyone from looking at the person holding it. Truth 3. Silence carries more information than speech. Nietzsche distrusted language on a deep, almost structural level. He saw it as a tool built collectively, by groups of people trying to coordinate and survive together, which meant it was built to smooth over friction, not expose it. Language, in his view, is built for consensus, not confession. So when you're trying to understand someone, don't just listen to what they say. Listen to what they won't say. Watch for the pause before someone answers a simple, low-stakes question, a pause that's slightly too long for the difficulty of the question. Watch for the topic that gets redirected a little too smoothly, a little too quickly, every single time it comes up. Watch for the answer that sounds rehearsed rather than felt, the kind of response that's clearly been given many times before, worn smooth like a stone in a river, because the real answer is too dangerous to hand over fresh. A person who changes the subject every time their childhood comes up isn't simply uninterested in the topic. A person who gives a suspiciously tidy, well-organized account of a messy breakup has likely rehearsed that account privately, dozens of times, specifically so they'd never have to feel it out loud in front of someone else. The silence or the near silence, or the too smooth deflection, that's the loudest sentence in the entire conversation, and most people miss it because they're too busy listening for words. Truth 4. The loudest moral crusader is usually the one with the most to hide. Be careful, Nietzsche would say, around the person who cannot stop reminding everyone how good, how ethical, how enlightened they are. The person who corrects everyone else's behavior constantly, who needs to be recognized as the most moral person in every room they enter. Nietzsche called this the will to power wearing a halo, the same hunger for dominance and control that shows up in bullies and tyrants, simply rerouted through virtue instead of force. Real integrity, in Nietzsche's view, is quiet, because it isn't performing for an audience. It doesn't need witnesses to exist. The moment virtue starts requiring applause, starts requiring a stage, starts requiring everyone else to be reminded of how much better it is than they are, you should start asking a different question entirely. What is this loud goodness distracting from? Sometimes it's guilt. Sometimes it's a private behavior that contradicts the public performance entirely. Sometimes it's simply an old, aching need to finally be seen as good enough. The need so large that ordinary decency can't satisfy it, so it has to be broadcast instead. Truth 5. Nobody lies to you first. They lie to themselves first. I'm fine. It doesn't bother me anymore. I don't need anyone. These phrases are rarely calculated manipulations aimed at you. Far more often, they are scripts a person has repeated to themselves so many times, in so many private moments, that the line between performance and genuine belief has completely dissolved. Nietzsche understood self-deception not as a moral failing, not as evil, but as a survival mechanism, a way of tolerating a reality that would otherwise be unbearable, to face directly and constantly. When someone's story about their own life doesn't quite add up, when the timeline shifts slightly each time they tell it, when the emotional tone doesn't match the words being used, they are almost never trying to deceive you. They've been quietly deceiving themselves for years, refining the story a little more each time, and you are simply close enough and paying enough attention to notice the seams where the story doesn't perfectly close. This reframe changes everything about how you respond to inconsistency in someone else. Instead of feeling betrayed or suspicious, you can feel something closer to compassion, because you're not witnessing a con. You're witnessing someone's oldest, most exhausting survival strategy in action. Truth 6. Superiority is inferiority wearing a crown. The person who constantly reminds you of their achievements, their intelligence, their status, is rarely as secure as the performance suggests. Nietzsche would say they are rehearsing proof, building a case, out loud again and again, against a private fear that they don't actually measure up. The person who needs to dominate every conversation, who cannot allow silence or disagreement without escalating, is not powerful. They are terrified of becoming irrelevant, invisible, forgettable, and dominance is simply the loudest way to avoid that fate. Real confidence, in contrast, has nothing left to prove, which is exactly why it so rarely performs. It doesn't need the room. It doesn't need the last word. When you meet someone who absolutely must win every conversation, every argument, every comparison, resist the urge to be intimidated. Look past the throne they've built for themselves. Underneath it, almost without exception, is a frightened child who once learned that being ordinary meant being invisible, and who has been terrified of ordinary ever since. Arguments, not to feel superior to the people around you, but to see them clearly enough that hatred and judgment start to feel almost impossible. That, and nothing else, was Nietzsche's actual goal, not a weaponized form of insight, but an honest, uncomfortable, deeply human form of connection. 6 truths in, and you should already be experiencing the shift Nietzsche was pointing toward. The coworker who interrupts you in every meeting isn't simply rude. They are afraid of disappearing from the conversation entirely. The friend obsessively posting a curated, perfect version of their life online isn't thriving in the way it appears. They may, in fact, be quietly asking to be caught, to be seen underneath the filter. Use all of this not to win arguments, not to feel superior to the people around you, but to see them clearly enough that hatred and judgment start to feel almost impossible. That, and nothing else, was Nietzsche's actual goal. Not a weaponized form of insight, but an honest, uncomfortable, deeply human form of connection. If any of the first 6 truths already brought someone specific to mind, a parent, a partner, a coworker, or even yourself, sit with that for a moment before continuing. And when you're ready, let's go deeper, because part 2 is where the mask stops holding and starts to actually crack. Secondly is the fracture. You've now learned to notice the mask itself. This next section is about the moment it slips, because Nietzsche believed identity was never a fixed, stable thing. It was a performance under constant, quiet threat, and every threat, sooner or later, produces a leak. Truth 7. Almost every action is fear wearing the costume of a decision. Ask yourself genuinely why someone over-explains a simple, low-stakes choice as though they're building a legal defense. Ask why they say yes to something when every part of their body language is screaming no. Ask why they vanish emotionally, physically, entirely. The exact moment a relationship or conversation becomes real instead of casual. It is rarely about desire in the way we usually assume. Nietzsche would say it is almost always about fear. Fear of abandonment, fear of humiliation, fear of being exposed as not enough. So stop asking the surface-level question, what does this person want? Start asking the deeper one. What are they afraid of losing? That single question, asked honestly and repeatedly, will tell you more about a human being than a decade of polite small talk ever could. Truth 8. Repeated criticism is a confession in disguise. When someone cannot stop attacking a particular trait in the people around them, resist the instinct to look at the target of that criticism. Look instead at the person doing the shooting. The man who constantly mocks emotional people as weak or dramatic is very often terrified of his own unprocessed feelings. The woman who tears apart other people's appearance in casual conversation is frequently at quiet war with her own reflection. Nietzsche understood judgment as rarely being about the object of the judgment at all. It is projection, and projection functions as a direct leak straight to someone's deepest, least examined wound. If you learn to trace repeated criticism backward instead of forward, asking not what's wrong with them, but what does this reveal about the speaker, you gain access to a kind of emotional X-ray most people never learn to use. Truth 9. Chronic confidence is often guilt wearing a costume. There is a very specific kind of person who is always composed, always certain, always visibly in control of every room they enter, until you watch closely enough, for long enough, to notice the tension in their jaw during small talk, the way they over-prepare for conversations that shouldn't require preparation at all. The subtle defensiveness that appears the instant they're questioned. Nietzsche observed this constantly in people whose entire identity depends on projecting certainty. Leaders, preachers, teachers, public figures. Real peace in his framing has nothing left to perform, because it isn't afraid of being seen without the performance. When someone's confidence starts to feel less like ease and more like effort, resist the instinct to be intimidated by it. Get curious instead about exactly what that effort is working so hard to protect. Truth 10. Exaggeration is a person betraying themselves in real time. I genuinely don't care what anyone thinks of me. I'm always happy, nothing gets to me. Statements like these are rarely simple facts. Much more often, they are volume, turned up specifically to drown out an internal doubt that's too quiet to silence any other way. Nietzsche believed that extremity in any direction, including extreme positivity or extreme indifference, is itself a form of imbalance, not a form of strength. So when someone's claim about themselves sounds too absolute, too clean, too rehearsed to be simply true, don't take the content of the claim at face value. Ask instead what it's working so hard to silence underneath. The exaggeration is rarely the truth. It's usually the sound of someone fighting the truth as loudly as they can. Truth 11. The need for control is inner chaos, managed from the outside. Some people need everything around them ordered. Scheduled, predictable, controlled down to the smallest detail, not because they are powerful or disciplined in the way it appears, but because their inner emotional world feels like it is one loose thread away from completely unraveling. Nietzsche saw obsessive control not as strength but as compensation, an external structure built specifically because the internal one feels unreliable. The person who cannot tolerate spontaneity, who insists on dominating every plan and every decision, who panics visibly at the smallest disruption to a schedule, is not demonstrating strength. They are holding something together with both hands, in real time, and the stricter and more rigid the exterior becomes, the more fragile the interior usually is underneath it. Truth 12. The loudest performance often comes from the emptiest place. This may be one of Nietzsche's most quietly devastating insights, and it has only become more relevant with time. Constant performance, for attention, for validation, for an audience of any size, is not strength, and it is not confidence. It is far more often evidence of a person who does not believe they will be loved or noticed. Without the performance running constantly in the background, the curated online life, the endless updates, the compulsive need to be seen doing, achieving, succeeding, enjoying. Nietzsche would call this desperation dressed carefully as confidence. The person who has actually made peace with who they are doesn't need a permanent audience to confirm it. So when someone's entire life starts to resemble a performance more than a life, understand it for what it most likely is. Not a display of power, but a quiet, ongoing request to finally be noticed. You're no longer simply reading minds. You're reading patterns, which is a far more reliable and far more compassionate skill. The constant interrupting isn't arrogance. It's a fear of being forgotten mid-sentence. The relentless bragging isn't strength. It's an old wound being soothed over and over in public. None of this is about gaining leverage over the people around you. It's about finally, fully understanding them, and in the process, understanding the parts of yourself that operate on exactly the same hidden logic. There is one layer left, the deepest one. The layer where behavior stops being about the present moment entirely and reveals itself as a message sent from someone's childhood, decades earlier still playing on a loop. That's part 3. Thirdly is the wound. Everything up to this point has focused on behavior, the visible, observable surface of a person. This final part is about origin, because Nietzsche believed that behind every pattern is a belief, and behind every belief is a wound that was never given the chance to properly heal. Truth 13. Nobody argues from logic. They argue from pain. You would like to believe that people form their opinions through calm, rational deliberation. Nietzsche would strongly disagree. He believed that, underneath almost every firmly held conviction is an emotional wound wearing the disguise of an argument. Someone who insists, with total confidence, that love isn't real, it's just biology and chemical timing, is not simply stating a neutral fact. They are protecting a heartbreak they never fully processed, using the language of science as a shield. People form their deepest beliefs around whatever hurt them most, and then reverse engineer logic afterward to defend that belief as though it arrived through reason alone. So stop asking, what does this person believe? Start asking, what broke them badly enough that they needed this belief in order to keep functioning? That single shift in questioning will change the way you experience every disagreement you have for the rest of your life. Truth 14. How someone treats the powerless reveals everything about their real power. Do not judge a person's character by how they behave around people who can benefit them, promote them, or fight back against them. Judge it instead by how they behave around people who cannot do any of those things. The waiter, the intern, the child, the person who is already losing an argument. Nietzsche believed that real strength reveals itself through restraint, not domination. The person who mocks vulnerability in someone weaker than them is almost always terrified of their own. The person who punishes small, harmless mistakes severely was very likely never permitted to make any mistakes themselves. But the person who can witness someone else's weakness without judgment, who can choose forgiveness in a moment, where cruelty would have been just as easy and far more satisfying, that is someone no longer fighting an internal war with themselves. Give someone a quiet moment where compassion is optional and cruelty is convenient. What they choose in that unremarkable moment will tell you more about them than any conversation ever could. Truth 15. The fear of being forgotten looks like the need to be seen. Some people need to be noticed in every room they enter, every conversation they join, every photo they appear in. At first glance, this looks like confidence, even magnetism. Nietzsche believed it is very often the opposite. A person quietly terrified of disappearing, without leaving any trace behind them at all, of living and dying without ever mattering to anyone. A child who went consistently unnoticed, whose needs were minimized or dismissed, frequently becomes an adult who overcompensates loudly, because asking directly for love or attention once felt far too dangerous, or simply never worked. So instead of asking for connection plainly, they generate noise, performance, sometimes even chaos. Because chaos at least guarantees attention. When you meet someone who feels like too much, resist the instinct to judge that intensity. Ask instead what they believe will happen to them the moment they finally go quiet. Truth 16. We attack in others what we secretly envy. One of the hardest truths in this entire list to sit with, honestly, is this one. People frequently don't tear others down out of simple hatred. They do it out of an admiration they cannot afford to consciously feel. Watching someone else openly embody a version of life you quietly gave up on. Freedom, confidence, success, joy is genuinely painful. And criticism is almost always easier to tolerate than that particular kind of grief. So the coworker who mocks someone's ambition, the friend who gossips relentlessly about someone else's newfound freedom or happiness, is not simply being cruel for its own sake. They are, in their own indirect and often unconscious way, mourning something they buried in themselves long ago. Envy in this framing is nothing more than unspoken desire. Desire that gave up on the belief that it was ever allowed to exist in the first place. Truth 17. People aren't repeating beliefs. They're repeating childhood. The familiar idea that people don't change is close to true, but not quite precise enough. Nietzsche's version would sound more like this. People repeat. They repeat the emotional roles they were forced into as children, the fears they were taught to carry before they were old enough to question them, the relational dynamics they were never given the chance to escape. A person who was never truly heard as a child frequently becomes an adult who cannot genuinely listen to others. A person who was punished or shamed for expressing emotion becomes cold, logical and detached by default, treating feeling itself as a liability. A person who had to earn love through performance and achievement becomes someone who performs endlessly for affection. As an adult, even in relationships where that performance is actively costing them their own well-being, they believe sincerely that they are acting from personal beliefs and preferences. In reality, they are simply reenacting the past in an adult body, on a loop, without realizing the tape is even playing. Truth 18. A person's patterns are their confession. This is the final truth, and it quietly ties every other one together. People frequently do not have the vocabulary to articulate what actually hurt them, but they will show you, again and again, through what they repeat, whether or not they intend to. The person who disappears the instant intimacy starts to feel real. The person who overworks compulsively, specifically to avoid sitting still with their own thoughts. The person who connects easily and briefly with everyone, and deeply with no one at all. None of these are accidents or random personality quirks. They are confessions on a loop, quietly repeating the same 3 sentences. This is how I learned to protect myself. This is where I was hurt. This is what I am terrified of experiencing again. If you learn to listen to patterns rather than words, you will come to understand people before they have said a single, explicit sentence about themselves, and uncomfortably, you will start to recognize your own patterns with the exact same clarity. Every single one of these 18 truths was never, ultimately, about the other people in your life. It was about you, your own patterns, your own fears, the scripts you inherited long before you were old, enough to consciously choose them for yourself. Nietzsche never intended this kind of insight to become a weapon, used against other people. He intended it as a mirror, because the moment you genuinely understand why someone performs, controls, disappears, exaggerates, or lashes out, you stop reacting to them on instinct, and you start understanding them instead, which is a far more powerful and far more difficult thing to do. And somewhere inside that understanding, if you're honest with yourself, you'll find a slightly more honest version of you. One that's a little harder to fool and a little easier to forgive. If one of these 18 truths hit closer to home than you expected, about someone else or about yourself, say which one in the comments below. And if this changed the way you see the people around you, even slightly, subscribe, like, and share. This isn't the end of learning to see clearly. It's only the beginning.